A childhood of unrelenting tragedy. John Kelley was born on a cold February night in 1975 in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. From the start, life offered him little in the way of comfort or safety. His parents, Margaret and Robert Kelley, had been struggling in their turbulent marriage long before his birth. Margaret worked double shifts as a waitress at a local diner to make ends meet, while Robert, who was frequently unemployed, spent most of his time nursing a bottle of cheap bourbon. The household was marred by fights that regularly escalated into violence, filling John's early memories with the haunting echoes of screaming voices, breaking glass, and slammed doors. When John was just 5 years old, his parents' fragile relationship shattered entirely. That year, Margaret filed for divorce and gained custody of John, believing it was the best way to give him a stable environment. However, her health took a turn for the worse, forcing her to work fewer hours. Without a steady income, she found herself unable to support her son. After months of financial hardship, she made the heart-wrenching decision to return John to his father's custody, despite knowing Robert's propensity for anger and neglect. Living with Robert was nothing short of a nightmare for the young boy. Robert often came home drunk, slurring insults about John's weakness and good-for-nothing blood. On nights when the alcohol robbed him of whatever shred of self-restraint he had left, Robert would lash out physically, slapping or hitting John over the smallest perceived slight. Once John accidentally spilled a glass of water onto Robert's paperwork. Enraged, his father grabbed him by the arm and threw him against the wall, breaking one of John's ribs. No one at school noticed the bruises hidden under his oversized, tattered clothing. If they did, no one said anything. By the age of 7, John became acclimated to being left alone for long stretches of time, as Robert would frequently disappear on weekend-long benders. On these nights, the boy resorted to rummaging through neighbors' trash cans for food scraps or stealing from corner stores. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing away at both his body and his spirit. At school, he struggled academically, barely able to keep up with his classmates. Isolation became his norm, as other children ridiculed him for his shabby clothes and grimy appearance. Teachers would shake their heads, labeling him a lost cause, rather than attempting to understand the neglect he faced. Despite his dire circumstances, John clung to one source of solace: a stray mutt he named Shadow. Shadow, like John, seemed to have nowhere to belong. The two became inseparable. Shadow would wait at the edge of the schoolyard every afternoon, wagging his tail in excitement whenever John appeared. On especially harsh nights, John would curl up next to the dog in the backyard shed, grasping at the warmth and companionship Shadow provided. But even this small refuge was fleeting. One evening, in a violent outburst, Robert discovered the dog and, in a drunken rage, beat Shadow with a lead pipe. John watched from a crack in his bedroom door, frozen in horror as the only friend he had ever known was taken from him. Shadow's lifeless body was left in the yard until morning, a cruel reminder of the brutality that permeated John's world. As the years wore on, the emotional scars deepened, carving into John not just anger but searing resentment. He viewed adults as unreliable, selfish creatures incapable of love or care. Unfortunately, these feelings left John with a distorted understanding of relationships and trust. Every adult he had encountered so far in life, his parents, teachers, social workers, had either hurt him, ignored him, or deemed him unworthy of better circumstances. At the age of 12, John ran away from home for the first time. Lacking any sense of direction, he wandered the streets of Detroit, sneaking into alleys and abandoned buildings to sleep. He became adept at petty theft, picking pockets and stealing sandwiches from outdoor diners to survive. It was during one of these escapades that he was caught shoplifting from a local convenience store. Officer Howard Williams, a gruff but kind-hearted patrolman, noticed the fear in John's eyes and chose leniency. "Listen, kid," Howard said, kneeling down to be at eye level. "You keep going down this road, and it ends in only two places: prison or a grave. You're too young to throw your life away." He handed John a granola bar and escorted him out instead of pressing charges. Howard's words struck a chord, but they weren't enough to deter the growing storm inside the boy. By the time he reached his teen years, John had become a bitter, volatile adolescent who saw the world in shades of hostility and malice. He blamed society for his suffering, and any compassion he might have once possessed was buried under years of trauma and mistreatment. Attempts to reach him through foster care or counseling programs proved futile. He viewed every helping hand with suspicion, assuming ulterior motives behind every kind gesture. Looking back, it's clear that the cracks in John's psyche had begun to form early. His childhood was not defined by warmth or joy, but by survival in an environment that fostered fear and loathing. Those formative years hardened him, shaping the foundation of a man who would go on to wreak unimaginable pain upon others. The boy who once cried silently for help, beneath layers of neglect and despair, had become a vessel for hate, and his descent into darkness was tragically all but inevitable. A youth lost in chaos. By the time John turned 13, the once shy and withdrawn boy had grown into a volatile teenager, deeply scarred by years of trauma and neglect. If his childhood had been marked by hunger, abuse, and isolation, his teenage years were the inevitable unraveling, a descent into chaos from which there seemed to be no return. John began to spend more time on the streets, drawn to the gritty underbelly of Detroit where rules were unwritten, and survival was the only currency that mattered. The sense of lawlessness appealed to him. It was a world where strength and cunning won out, unlike the stifling environment at school or the suffocating neglect of home. By now, John was fully estranged from his father, whose drunken violence had only worsened with age, and the streets provided him the freedom to be out of Robert Kelley's reach. His first real taste of street life came when he was taken in by a group of older boys who styled themselves as a gang. They were petty criminals, pickpockets, shoplifters, and the kind of kids who'd break into abandoned cars just for the thrill of it. To John, these older boys represented something his life had lacked for as long as he could remember: acceptance. They gave him a nickname, Scrap, inspired by his willingness to fight anyone who crossed him despite his wiry frame. He wore that nickname like a badge of honor, finally feeling like he belonged somewhere even if it was among outcast misfits. It didn't take long for John to gain a reputation for his temper and unpredictability. He took on riskier tasks than his peers, snatching purses in broad daylight, climbing into high-risk buildings during burglaries, and starting fights with rival groups. One time, when an older member of the gang mocked him for being the youngest kid in the group, John retaliated by slashing the boy's bike tires. "That little maniac," the gang leader mused, half admiring, half afraid. John had discovered that fear could be just as useful as friendship in cementing his place within the group. However, the camaraderie he sought in the gang was superficial at best. On the streets, loyalty was a fleeting concept, and betrayals came as easily as handshakes. One night, after a botched shoplifting attempt at a downtown convenience store, the older boys fled the scene, leaving John to face the wrath of the store owner who caught him in the act. The man dragged him by the collar, yelling expletives before tossing him into the alley like trash. Humiliated and bruised, John limped back to his hideout, fueled with a growing realization: trust was a liability, and he couldn't rely on anyone but himself. His escalating antics soon caught the attention of law enforcement. He was arrested for the first time at 14 after being caught stealing a pack of cigarettes and a soda from a gas station. It was a small, seemingly inconsequential crime, but it marked the beginning of his entanglement with the juvenile justice system. Standing in front of the judge for his arraignment, John looked out into the courtroom and saw no one there for him, not his father, nor any of the gang members he once considered family. For the second time in his life, he was confronted with a bitter truth: he was utterly alone. The court's intervention hardly served to rehabilitate him. Sent to a group home for troubled youth, John found himself in an environment eerily similar to the one he had tried to escape. The staff, overworked and underpaid, rarely intervened in conflicts between the boys. The older teens often bullied and humiliated the younger ones, and John quickly learned that violence was the only language they respected. During his first week, another boy, twice John's size, attempted to steal a food voucher out of his pocket. John responded by breaking the boy's nose with a metal tray. It was an escalation that earned him a month in solitary confinement and a new level of notoriety among the other residents. From then on, John was left alone, but the experience hardened him further, solidifying the idea that the world was a brutal place where compassion was as rare as gold. John's time in the group home exposed him to an even darker world. Many of the boys spoke openly about their crimes, and John listened attentively, filing away every piece of knowledge like a sponge. One boy bragged about hot wiring cars, another explained how to rob a house without setting off alarms, and yet another shared tips on how to intimidate store clerks without attracting too much attention. These were lessons John would later use as he escalated from petty theft to more serious offenses. By 16, John was back on the streets, but he wasn't the same vulnerable boy who had entered the group home. He was colder, crueler, and more calculated. His minor crimes slowly escalated. Shoplifting turned into armed robbery. and fights with rival gangs turned into near-deadly altercations. On one occasion, he picked a fight with an older boy who insulted him. The altercation ended with John pulling a stolen switchblade and leaving the boy bleeding on the ground. Though the victim survived, John felt no remorse. It was the very lack of consequence that emboldened him further. Things spiraled out of control when John began experimenting with drugs. To numb the constant ache of an empty stomach, he started taking pills offered by other street kids. What started as occasional experimentation quickly developed into dependency. High on a cocktail of unknown substances, John's rashness veered toward recklessness. He once broke into an electronics store not for the loot but simply because he was dared to by another gang member. While addiction dragged him further into despair, it also made him more unpredictable and dangerous. He committed his first armed robbery at 17 after holding up a fast food restaurant. Holding the gun, stolen from a pawn shop, gave him a sense of power he had never experienced before. He reveled in the fear on the cashier's face as he demanded the cash drawer, savoring the emotions he lacked in his own life: control, dominance, and superiority. Though he only escaped with a couple $100s, the rush was intoxicating. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exerting power over a world that had always looked down on him. Sadly, any chance of redemption for John faded further and further into the distance. His path during these formative years was filled with violence, anger, and a twisted form of self-reliance. Each reckless decision and each crime committed built the foundation for the dark path he would soon follow. The boy who once stole to fill his stomach was now stealing to feed an insatiable desire for control. A youth that could have been spent learning, laughing, and growing into something better was instead lost amidst the chaos of abandonment, betrayal, and a yearning for power in all the wrong places. John Kelley had become a force of destruction, and the storm was only just beginning. The first act of crime. The transition from petty theft to outright violence was, for John Kelley, less of a leap and more of a slow, inevitable slide. He had been edging closer to that line for years, testing limits, pushing boundaries, but always stopping just short of no return. That changed on a cold autumn evening in 1993 when, at the age of 18, John committed his first violent crime. A crime that would forever alter the course of his life and solidify the darkness that had been festering within him. By this point in his life, John had already spent years surviving on the fringes of society. He was a regular in the back alleys and shadowy corners of Detroit, hustling for scraps, ducking the law, and learning the unspoken rules of the streets. He believed he was invisible, a nameless, faceless nobody, in a world that cared nothing for him. But on that night, John decided he would no longer be invisible. He would make the world see him, even if it was through fear. It began at a gas station just off a quiet stretch of highway where the flickering neon lights hummed over an otherwise silent parking lot. John had cased the area earlier in the day, eyeing potential targets and memorizing their routines. He wasn't looking for something big, just some quick cash to buy food and maybe a few more pills to numb the ever-present ache in his chest. He targeted a small convenience store that, based on his observations, was manned by nothing more than a single clerk during late hours. That evening, John walked into the store wearing an oversized hoodie, his hands shoved into the pockets where he hid the sharp kitchen knife he had stolen from a shelter weeks earlier. The store was as quiet as he'd expected, empty of customers save for a young clerk at the counter. The clerk couldn't have been much older than John himself, barely 20, with dark hair and a nervous, almost twitchy demeanor. It didn't matter. To John, he wasn't a person. Not really. He was just an obstacle standing between him and survival. John went through the motions at first, pretending to browse the aisles, grabbing a bag of chips and a bottle of soda as if he were a paying customer. But as he approached the counter, his heart began to hammer in his chest. Every survival instinct he'd honed over the years screamed at him to walk away, to leave before things got out of hand. But walking away wasn't an option. Not anymore. He'd already made his decision. He set the items down on the counter and waited until the clerk looked away, fumbling with the cash register. That's when John made his move. In one swift motion, he pulled the knife from his pocket and pointed it directly at the clerk's chest. "Open the register," he said, his voice low and guttural. The clerk froze, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the blade. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed deafening in the silence. Then, trembling, the clerk began to comply, his shaking fingers struggling to punch in the code to unlock the cash drawer. "Faster!" John snapped, taking a step closer. His hand was steady on the knife, but inside, he was anything but calm. His mind was racing, his pulse roaring in his ears. He hadn't thought much further than this moment, hadn't considered what he would do if something went wrong. And something did go wrong. As the drawer slid open with a mechanical ding, the clerk made a split-second decision. Maybe it was panic, or maybe it was defiance, but instead of handing over the money, he reached for the baseball bat hidden under the counter. The bat came out swinging, narrowly missing John's shoulder as he stumbled backward in surprise. The sight of the bat sent John into a blind rage. His world narrowed to a single blinding point of anger. Anger at the clerk for fighting back, anger at the world for putting him in this situation, and anger at himself for being too scared to follow through. Without thinking, John lunged forward, his knife slashing wildly. The blade caught the clerk's arm, drawing a thin line of blood as the young man yelped in pain and dropped the bat. Now it was John's turn to act. He reached over the counter, grabbing a handful of crumpled bills from the register, no more than $200, but enough to justify the risk in his mind. As he turned to run, his foot caught on a counter display, sending bags of chips and candy tumbling to the floor. He bolted out the door, the clerk's panicked shouts echoing behind him. John ran until his lungs burned, not stopping until he was several blocks away, hidden in the shadows of an abandoned lot. He collapsed onto the ground, clutching the stolen money in one hand and the bloody knife in the other. His breaths came in ragged gasps as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a hollow, gnawing feeling in his chest. He should have felt victorious, empowered even, but all he felt was empty. The world hadn't changed. He was still the same invisible nobody he'd always been. Back at the store, the clerk was calling 911, his bloodied arm wrapped in a towel. Though he didn't know it at the time, his description of the attacker, male, early 20s, average build, wearing a hoodie, would do little to narrow the search. In a city like Detroit, where crime was an everyday occurrence, John Kelley was just another statistic. For John, however, the robbery was more than a petty crime. It was a tipping point, a moment that awakened something dark within him. The act of wielding power over another person, even for just a brief moment, had been intoxicating. He hated the fear he'd seen in the clerk's eyes, but he couldn't deny the grim satisfaction it brought him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was in control. And control was something he had been denied for far too long. In the weeks that followed, John committed several more robberies, each one more brazen than the last. He began to seek out riskier targets, not for the money, but for the adrenaline rush. The knife became a constant companion, tucked away in his pocket like a secret he carried with him everywhere he went. What had started as a desperate act of survival was quickly spiraling into something far darker, a need to prove to himself and the world that he was no longer powerless. Looking back, it's clear that this first crime was the beginning of the end for John Kelley. It was the moment when the lines between right and wrong blurred, when survival morphed into dominance, and when the boy who had spent his life running finally started to fight back, even if it meant destroying everything in his path. The spark of a vicious crime spree. The events of John Kelley's first robbery marked a pivotal turning point in his life, but what followed after was far darker. A crime spree fueled not only by desperation but by a growing appetite for control, violence, and chaos. It was as if something within him had finally snapped. No longer constrained by hesitation or fear, John moved forward with a reckless determination. What started as petty robbery evolved into a series of increasingly brutal and calculated attacks that terrorized the Midwest for years to come. In late 1994, just shy of his 20th birthday, John committed what many criminologists and forensic psychologists later referred to as his true first kill. Unlike the desperate, chaotic robbery in the gas station, this crime was premeditated, deliberate, and savagely violent, marking the moment John transitioned from a petty criminal into something far more sinister. The first kill, a murder in the park. It was a late autumn evening in a suburban Detroit park. The air was crisp and cold, the trees half bare as the last of the fallen leaves littered the ground. John had been loitering at the edge of the park for most of the afternoon, watching and waiting. His target wasn't random, he had an internal calculus that guided his selection. Couples, particularly those showing happiness or affection, seemed to draw his ire. He scanned for vulnerability and for signs of something he personally lacked, connection and love. He found that in a young couple sitting on a wooden bench by a small pond, laughing quietly and holding hands. To John, they weren't just two people enjoying an innocent moment, they represented everything he hated about the world. They symbolized a cruel joke, flaunting what he could never have. Over the years, John had internalized his hatred and pain, converting them into a twisted narrative that painted the world as his enemy. And on that evening, the couple became the focus of his fury. John approached them slowly, blending into the dim light of the park's pathway. The knife in his jacket pocket felt heavy but familiar, as much a part of him as his own hands. When he reached the couple, he wasted no time. Pulling the blade, he attacked the male first, stabbing him in the back while the young man leaned forward to grab something from the ground. The attack was calculated and precise, severing vital arteries and silencing the victim in seconds. The young woman screamed and tried to run, but John caught her by the arm, dragging her to the ground. What followed was a brutal assault, the details of which would haunt both law enforcement and locals for years. When it was over, John disappeared into the night, leaving behind 2 lifeless bodies and a scene of unimaginable horror. The response from the local police was swift but ultimately ineffective. In an era before sophisticated surveillance systems and DNA databases, the case was destined for obscurity. Witnesses were non-existent, and the physical evidence, while gruesome, offered no clue as to the identity of the killer. For John, this lack of consequence only emboldened him further. He realized he could walk among society's shadows, striking when and where he pleased, and no one could stop him. A pattern emerges. John's next few murders followed a similar pattern, targeting couples in isolated areas, often parks or secluded walking trails. Each attack seemed to grow in brutality, and each was more calculated than the last. Over time, he established several horrifying rituals. For instance, after killing his male victims, John would often position the bodies in grotesque ways, as if daring anyone who found the crime scene to try and make sense of the chaos he left behind. His female victims were subjected to unspeakable acts of violence, each attack evidence of his growing hatred and a deepening disregard for humanity. Investigators eventually began to notice connections between the attacks, though at first, they failed to grasp the scope of what they were dealing with. The unusual level of violence and the lack of material gain were striking to detectives. This wasn't someone killing for money or revenge. This was a killer operating on impulse and rage. One homicide detective who later worked on the case remarked, "Each of these scenes felt personal. It's almost like he wasn't just killing, he was retaliating. Retaliating against what? We didn't know." Escalation, conquering suburbs and rural towns. As law enforcement increased patrols around Detroit and its neighboring suburbs, John began to expand his hunting grounds. Stealing a weathered, beat-up sedan, he drove for hours into sleepy Midwestern towns, lurking in places that had never known the cold touch of a serial killer. He avoided major highways, instead choosing rural backroads that wound into towns untouched by big city dangers. In the spring of 1995, John struck in a quiet community near Kalamazoo, Michigan. A pair of teenagers out on a date became his next victims. They had parked their car on the side of a wooded trail, hoping for a moment of privacy away from their families and small-town watchfulness. It was the perfect setting for John. After slitting the tires of their vehicle to ensure they couldn't escape, John lay in wait until the couple noticed the damage and stepped out to investigate. Like a predator stalking prey, he pounced. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes, though the aftermath made national headlines for over a month. Their bodies were discovered 3 days later in a nearby creek, with evidence of unspeakable brutality. By now, John was no longer relying solely on instinct or opportunity. He was planning, refining, and perfecting his crimes. He carried a small toolkit consisting of duct tape, gloves, a spare knife, and even a pair of plastic shoe covers to avoid leaving prints. It became clear to law enforcement that this was no ordinary criminal. John was evolving, growing smarter and bolder with each passing month. Emotion versus control. Despite the calculated nature of his crimes, John was ultimately fueled by raw emotion. Each act of violence was deeply rooted in the bitterness and loss that had defined his early years. The couples he targeted weren't completely random, they embodied in John's warped mind ideals of love, happiness, and connection that he had been denied. Yet, the control he wielded over his victims became an addiction. Every shout, every tear, every attempt to resist fed the illusion that he was finally in charge of his destiny. To him, the world had always been cruel and ruthless. Now, he was simply returning the favor. The unchecked monster. Between 1994 and 1996, John Kelley claimed at least 8 lives, and those are just the ones investigators later linked conclusively to him. Some victims were discovered weeks, Even months later, their cases initially dismissed as isolated incidents or unrelated tragedies. Meanwhile, John roamed free with no fixed address, no identifiable motive, and no one who would miss him long enough to alert authorities. The media began to stir, coining ominous nicknames like the Shadow Slayer and the Phantom of the Midwest, though the lack of a consistent killing pattern left the public and investigators in a state of perpetual unease. John Kelley's reign of terror had only just begun, and no one could predict how far he would go. The killer in the shadows. By the mid-1990s, the name John Kelley still meant nothing to the public and law enforcement. He was not a man. He was a shadow, a phantom slipping through the cracks of society. His reign of terror was unlike anything the Midwest had seen, a series of heinous murders carried out with such calculated brutality and anonymity that authorities struggled to connect the dots. John did not leave behind calling cards or written manifestos. His signature, if any, was the overwhelming silence he left behind after his attacks and the haunting lack of motive. Nicknamed the Phantom of the Midwest by journalists, John became a figure of quiet but deadly fear in suburban communities. People locked their doors earlier, abandoned late-night strolls in the park, and whispered about reports they'd seen on the news. Another couple found their lives stolen by a predator in the dark. His victims, often lovers or pairs of friends, were from all walks of life. Young professionals walking their dogs, college students on dates, or even married couples enjoying a night under the stars. But what connected them all, in John's twisted mind, was their happiness. A happiness that he saw as mocking him, taunting him with what he could never have. Operating in the shadows. The hallmark of John's crimes was his ability to seemingly disappear after each attack. Despite increasingly intense manhunts, law enforcement could not pin down his methods, nor could they predict where he would strike next. He relied on his mobility and instinct, moving through small towns and isolated neighborhoods in a weathered, untraceable sedan that was as nondescript as he was. While larger cities like Detroit and Cleveland might have offered him anonymity, John seemed to prefer suburban and rural areas where people felt safest, where locks were just a formality and darkened streets were commonplace. John would scout his targets in plain sight. He wore a guise of normalcy, a man dressed in simple, forgettable clothes, his appearance too average for anyone to remember. Once he chose a location, often a quiet park, a hidden hiking trail, or a dimly lit parking lot, he would spend hours watching his victims, studying their movements. He struck at the most vulnerable moments, and when the attacks were done, he melted away as if he'd never been there. His ability to evade capture earned him an almost mythical reputation among locals. "It's like he's not even real," one resident in Kalamazoo, Michigan said after hearing about a brutal double murder in the area. "It's like the boogeyman's come to life." Adapting and evolving John thrived on adaptability, while most serial killers followed ritualistic patterns that allowed law enforcement to build a profile on them. John operated differently. His approach was fluid, pragmatic even. If one method of attack worked, he used it again, but if it didn't, he changed his tactics. Early in his spree, John primarily relied on his knife, using stealth and close-range strikes to overpower his victims. As time went on, however, he began experimenting with other weapons. From blunt objects to garrotes fashioned from wire or twine, John's evolving brutality only made him harder to identify and predict. In one particularly harrowing incident in Ohio, John lured a couple into an abandoned factory by leaving the man's wallet on the ground. When the pair entered the darkened building to retrieve it, they found themselves cornered by John, who emerged from the shadows like a predator stalking its prey. The man died from multiple stab wounds while the woman was found bound and gagged, her throat slit. Investigators would later remark on the sheer precision and audacity of the attack. "He isn't just killing," one detective observed, "he's hunting. There's a cold logic to what he's doing, and that makes him infinitely more dangerous." The master of fear. While his murders were undeniably violent, John's true weapon was fear. For him, terrorizing his victims was just as important, if not more so, than killing them. He relished watching the panic in their eyes as they tried and failed to escape. It gave him a sick sense of power, a twisted conquest over the world that had wronged him for so long. John's ability to instill fear extended far beyond his immediate victims. Entire towns lived in dread of his shadow. After each new killing, locals would gather at grocery stores, churches, and PTA meetings to exchange rumors and speculate about whether the killer would strike next in their community. Some bought guns, others installed extra locks or security cameras, and a few even moved away entirely. The media only heightened the hysteria, with reporters framing John as a faceless phantom who could be anywhere, watching, waiting. "People start seeing him everywhere," one reporter wrote in 1996. "A man in a hoodie at the bus stop, a shadowy figure walking down Main Street, the stranger parked across the street from their house. They imagine him because they're afraid to admit they have no idea who he is or where he'll strike next." Motive lost in the darkness. Despite their best efforts, psychologists and criminal profilers could not pinpoint John's motives with any clarity, largely because he left behind so little evidence. His crimes were personal, but only to him. He didn't taunt the police like other killers. He didn't leave messages, tokens, or any trace of remorse. His victims weren't targeted for wealth, race, or specific demographics. It was their perceived happiness that made them a target. In his eyes, the world had always worked against him, robbing him of love, joy, and human connection. Through murder, John regained control, striking back at the world that had left him an outcast. Investigators, however, believed John felt something deeper than simple resentment. Forensic evidence suggested that John spent significant time at each scene. After his killings, he lingered. This chilling detail hinted at a psychological need to relive the power of the moment, as if the act itself wasn't complete without fully absorbing the terror he had caused. A seasoned profiler on the case noted, "John Kelley didn't kill out of greed or compulsion, he killed out of deliberation. That's what makes him so dangerous. He knew exactly what he was doing." The towns left behind. John Kelley's presence left scars that would never fully heal on the towns and communities where he struck. Families mourned, lovers were torn apart, and peace seemed like an impossible dream. In some areas, his crimes shattered the fabric of close-knit neighborhoods that had once thrived on trust and openness. Where porch lights had once been left off at night, now they burned until dawn. Where children had once played in yards or biked down the streets after dark, now they were ushered inside before nightfall. "I used to let my kids walk to the ice cream parlor by themselves," recalled a mother in Gary, Indiana, after one of John's attacks. "Now I drive them, and I sit in the parking lot the whole time. You just don't know who's out there anymore." The darkness unchecked. While the fear John spread gripped the Midwest, John himself moved through the world unbothered by it all. He lived moment to moment, caring little for consequences or even his own survival. At times it seemed as though he wanted to be caught, pushing the limits of his own recklessness. But each time law enforcement got close, they found nothing, a void where answers should be. John Kelley remained as untouchable and unknowable as the shadows he hid in. He was, and would remain for years to come, the ultimate predator, a killer in the shadows, a man whom no one saw but whom everyone feared. Hell Night in suburban Chicago. By the turn of the millennium, John Kelley's chaotic, shadowy reign of terror showed no signs of slowing. His movements were unpredictable, his methods evolved with each attack, and despite the growing media frenzy surrounding him, his identity remained a mystery. Law enforcement from multiple states was grappling with a puzzle built from disjointed pieces, heinous crimes with no clear pattern beyond their cold-hearted brutality. In the summer of 2001, Kelley's killing spree culminated in one of his most horrifying attacks. This wasn't just another lethal strike in a quiet park or an empty rural road. This was something far worse, an entire suburban household torn apart in a single night. The chilling events that unfolded in a quiet subdivision just outside Chicago would become one of the darkest chapters in Midwest history, earning the macabre moniker Hell Night, the home at the edge of town. The victims that night were the Tanners, a family of 3 living in a modest home tucked toward the end of a sleepy cul-de-sac in a suburb west of Chicago. The Tanners were the picture of suburban normalcy. Jeffrey Tanner, 43, worked in finance. His wife Caroline, a 39-year-old elementary school teacher, was beloved by her students, and their 11-year-old daughter Lily was a cheerful, energetic girl who loved reading and playing soccer. The family had no known enemies, and their lives were, by all appearances, ordinary. But ordinary families were exactly the kind of target that stoked the fire in John Kelley. To him, the Tanners likely represented the kind of life he could never have, a home filled with warmth, laughter, and quiet security. Whether they were chosen at random or if Kelley had been stalking the family beforehand was never determined, but one thing was clear: his arrival at their doorstep on that fateful night was not accidental. The quiet before the storm. It was a warm, humid evening in August, and the Tanner family had spent the early part of their day at a neighborhood barbecue. Lily had laughed with friends, her parents had chatted with neighbors about summer plans, and by 10 p.m. the family had returned home, settling into their usual nightly routines. Jeffrey flipped through financial reports in his upstairs study. Caroline had fallen asleep early, exhausted from a long day in the summer heat. Lily, still wide awake, lay curled up on the couch in the living room, engrossed in the latest Harry Potter novel. Outside the cul-de-sac was quiet, the streetlights casting dim halos onto neatly trimmed lawns and parked SUVs. It was precisely the kind of neighborhood where people felt safe enough to leave windows cracked open to let in the night air. Unbeknownst to the Tanners, that sense of safety would be shattered within hours. Kelley's entry. John Kelley arrived just after midnight. He had spent the evening lurking in the shadows of the neighborhood, observing homes, studying which ones had lights on, and carefully noting movement. He moved methodically, his footsteps almost soundless as he crept along the side of the Tanner home. A small garden gate led to the backyard, where Kelley slipped through unnoticed. The kitchen window was left ajar, just enough for him to force it open with minimal noise. Once inside, Kelley paused, listening to the house's stillness, ensuring that his intrusion had gone undetected. The weight of his backpack was balanced on his shoulders, a bag he carried filled with tools of terror: duct tape, rope, a hunting knife, and a small crowbar. His movements were slow, deliberate, and calculated. The Tanner home was now his stage. A family torn apart. The first victim was Jeffrey Tanner. Kelley moved swiftly up the stairs, his boots soundlessly pressing against carpeted steps. He pushed open the door to Jeffrey's study, where the man sat at his desk, his back turned. Before Jeffrey could respond, Kelley struck him with the blunt end of the crowbar, the force knocking him from his chair. A second blow was delivered to silence him completely. Blood spattered onto the financial reports as Kelley dragged Jeffrey's limp body further into the room, leaving it hidden behind the desk. Next, Kelley turned his attention to Caroline, fast asleep in the couple's bedroom. She never saw him coming. The attack was quick but merciless, with the knife as his weapon of choice this time. She awoke in the final moments, her screams muffled by Kelley's gloved hand as he finished the job. What was left of the warm, kind-hearted teacher was nothing short of horrific. But Kelley wasn't finished. Lily Tanner, only 11 years old, had heard the muffled thump of her father falling and the faint cry of her mother. She had crept to the base of the stairs before John found her. Her final moments were filled with terror as Kelley cornered her in the living room. What followed was an act of unspeakable cruelty, one that law enforcement would later say haunted even the most seasoned investigators who arrived at the scene. The discovery. The following morning, the quiet cul-de-sac was transformed into a scene of chaos as police swarmed the Tanner home. A neighbor had noticed Lily's soccer ball sitting motionless in the front yard, paired with the eerie stillness of a house where the usual morning hustle and bustle should have been. Concerned, they knocked on the door but received no response. Within minutes, the same neighbor dialed 911. What officers discovered inside would lead one investigator to later remark, "It was as if hell itself had visited that home." Blood stained the floors and walls, furniture was overturned, and personal belongings were scattered. Kelley hadn't just killed, he had annihilated the idea of peace in that home. Each victim showed distressing signs of violence. Jeffrey, Caroline, and Lily were not just murdered, they were silenced in ways that left no doubt about the killer's calculated malice. Kelley's vanishing act. In typical fashion, John Kelley vanished after the attack, leaving behind no incriminating evidence beyond the horror he inflicted. He didn't leave fingerprints. He didn't leave footprints. He disappeared into the early morning fog like the phantom he had become known as. By the time investigators pieced together that this attack fit the emerging pattern of the Phantom of the Midwest, Kelley was likely already hundreds of miles away, blending seamlessly back into the obscurity he used as his shield. News of the Tanner family's extermination spread quickly, leaving suburban Chicago in a state of shock and fear. Local news outlets covered the tragedy for weeks. Pictures of Lily Tanner's school photos and smiling family moments graced TV screens and front pages, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Vigils were held. Neighbors wept for a family that had symbolized small-town America's quiet, idyllic life. The community's collapse. The attack had profound ripple effects across not just the neighborhood but the entire Chicago suburb. People began installing new locks, security systems, and motion-detected floodlights. Gun sales skyrocketed, families moved away unable to shake the paranoia that the phantom could return. "I used to feel safe here, we all did," a neighbor remarked tearfully to reporters. "But now, it feels like the walls are made of paper, like anyone can walk into your life and tear everything apart." The Tanners' home sat vacant for years, eventually decaying into an ominous shell of its former self. It became a grim landmark, proof to the town that darkness could descend anywhere, even where it was least expected. The reminder of evil Hell Night in suburban Chicago cemented John Kelley's reign of terror as something beyond comprehension. He wasn't simply a killer. He was a force of chaos, living in the darkest corners of human tragedy. The fear he left behind wasn't just about who he had killed, it was about who might be next. For John, this wasn't just another crime. It was an unambiguous declaration that he could invade even the safest spaces and leave them broken beyond repair. And as he disappeared once again into the anonymity that had always protected him, one chilling truth remained. Kelley wasn't done. A lull in unexpected signs. By the early 2000s, John Kelley's reign of terror had become one of the Midwest's most chilling mysteries. He had left a trail of destruction across multiple states, scattered bodies, shattered communities, and a legacy of fear that gripped quiet suburban neighborhoods. Then, almost inexplicably, Kelley seemed to vanish. The killings, so frequent and devastating, suddenly stopped. For law enforcement and the public alike, the silence brought a fragile sense of relief mixed with an unnerving uncertainty. Had the predator disappeared for good, or was he merely preparing for something worse? What no one could have imagined at the time was that John Kelley had slipped into a life no one would have predicted for a killer of his nature, a life that seemed on the surface painfully ordinary. The unexpected disappearance. For over 6 years, John Kelley had eluded capture, outwitting law enforcement and leaving behind nothing but questions. By 2001, after the so-called Hell Night massacre of the Tanner family in suburban Chicago, Kelley had cemented his reputation as a phantom killer, striking at will and vanishing into obscurity. Law enforcement agencies across the Midwest intensified their hunt for the man they called the Phantom of the Midwest. Task forces were assembled, sketches based on minimal witness descriptions circulated, and forensic databases were combed for connections, but nothing led to Kelley. He was a ghost, a predator whose only trace came in the form of grief-stricken families and bloodied crime scenes. Then, without warning, he disappeared. After years of relentless violence, Kelley simply faded into the shadows. Days turned into weeks, then months, then years, with no new murders that matched his MO. Investigators were left scratching their heads, unsure if the killer had been imprisoned for unrelated crimes, died, or moved to another part of the country, where his crimes remained undetected. A new life in plain sight. During this period of eerie silence, John Kelley was neither in prison nor dead. Instead, he had done something unfathomable for someone so consumed by chaos and violence. He'd constructed a new life for himself. Remarkably, Kelley retreated into a small suburban community in Minnesota, where he assumed a new identity under the alias Gregory Shaw. Far from the dark alleys and hunting grounds of his past, Kelley adopted the veneer of a quiet, unassuming man. Even more surprising was the role he played during this time, a husband. In 2002, Kelley married a woman named Susan, a 34-year-old office manager with no idea of her new husband's dark past. To Susan and her circle of friends, Gregory Shaw was kind, albeit quiet. He worked odd jobs, handyman tasks, landscaping contracts, and other labor roles that kept him busy but avoided too much attention. To those who knew him in this new chapter of his life, Gregory seemed perfectly average. He mowed his lawn on weekends, attended occasional barbecues hosted by neighbors, and watched football on Sundays. If there were any traces of the monster he had been, they were buried so deep that not even his closest acquaintances noticed. But monsters don't disappear. They simply evolve. Signs of the darkness within. While outwardly John Kelley maintained his disguise as Gregory Shaw, cracks in the facade began to show, though they were subtle. Susan occasionally mentioned to friends that her husband was a little off, describing his peculiar behavior. He would disappear for hours without explanation, claiming he needed to be alone to think. He was deeply uncomfortable in large social settings, rarely speaking unless prompted, and he seemed almost obsessed with maintaining control over his immediate surroundings. If things didn't go as planned, an unexpected visitor, a delayed dinner, Gregory would fall into moody silences that stretched for hours. More unsettling, however, was his odd fixation on certain people and situations. Neighbors later recounted how they occasionally caught Gregory staring at young couples in the park, watching them with quiet intensity. "At the time we thought he was just shy or awkward," one neighbor would recount years later. "But looking back, there was something unnerving about the way he'd just sit there and watch people, like a hunter sizing up his prey." Susan herself began to feel uneasy. Although her husband had never been overtly abusive, his temper flared unpredictably over trivial matters. On one occasion he smashed a plate against the wall when dinner was served later than expected. Yet, Susan dismissed these moments as stressed behavior. She had no reason to suspect her husband's darkness stretched far beyond minor domestic outbursts. The return of old habits. The lull in Kelley's behavior began to fray as the years went by. Keeping himself hidden under the guise of Gregory Shaw proved to be as exhausting as it was unnatural. He was a predator, and predators cannot deny their instincts forever. By late 2002, local authorities in Minnesota began to notice an unsettling trend. Reports of missing pets and acts of vandalism in quiet neighborhoods where nothing of note had ever happened before. Though seemingly minor, these incidents reflected a pattern. One that hinted at a growing frustration bubbling beneath the surface of Gregory Shaw's quiet life. Neighbors reported seeing Gregory wandering the streets late at night, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his old weathered jacket. "He just slipped through the streets almost like a shadow," a neighbor said years later. "At the time I figured he just had insomnia or something, but now I know better." In early 2003, Susan discovered something by accident that she would later tell police turned her blood cold. While cleaning out their attic, she stumbled across an old leather duffel bag of her husband's. Inside she found a pair of duct tape rolls, a rusted hunting knife, and a set of gloves. While the items themselves might not have been alarming on their own, Susan couldn't shake the sense that something was deeply wrong. When she questioned Gregory later that night, he became defensive, brushing off her concerns with an irritated wave of his hand. "Just tools," he said bluntly before warning her not to go through his belongings again. Tension mounts. As time wore on, Kelley's carefully constructed facade began to crack further. He grew visibly restless, disappearing more frequently and returning home in an agitated state. His patience wore thin, and Susan's once loving husband seemed to spiral into bouts of quiet rage. The signs were there, but like so many around her, Susan wanted to believe Gregory Shaw was the man she had married, not the monster her instincts told her he might be. What no one could have known, what even Kelley himself might not have fully realized, was that the lull was coming to an end. The predator within him could no longer stay dormant, could no longer be contained by this manufactured life of normalcy. The next chapter of John Kelley's reign of terror was already unfolding, and it would soon erupt in ways both horrifying and unexpected. The calm before the storm. During this strange period of quiet, law enforcement remained baffled by Kelley's disappearance, though they always feared it was temporary. Task force members assigned to the Phantom of the Midwest case knew his profile. This kind of killer didn't just stop. He might have been in hiding, or he might have relocated, but one thing was certain: he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. As it would turn out, their suspicions were correct. John Kelley, the Phantom Killer, had spent years concealing himself in plain sight, suppressing his instincts and cloaking himself in the illusion of normal life. But much like a raging fire beneath a thin layer of ash, the darkness was still burning. It was only a matter of time before it rose again, and when it did, it would be worse than anything they had ever seen before. The Man with Two Faces, a Criminal Living Two Lives. By 2004, John Kelley had achieved something most serial killers never could. He lived two lives, each as distinct as day and night. By day, he was Gregory Shaw, a quiet suburban handyman in Minnesota, seemingly harmless with a slight awkward edge. He mowed lawns, fixed fences, attended the occasional neighborhood barbecue, and blended into the mundane rhythm of small-town life. By night, however, the beast emerged, John Kelley, the predator. He was a man driven by bloodlust, anger, and an insatiable need for control. What made Kelley so diabolical wasn't just his brutality, it was his ability to deceive. He could wear the mask of a kind, dependable neighbor while hiding the dark, festering urges that defined his true self. The two opposite lives. On the surface, Gregory Shaw was the kind of man who barely attracted attention. In public he said very little, preferring to smile politely and remain somewhat in the background of any interaction. When he married Susan in 2002, he seemed to settle into his new role as a husband and community member. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, hard-working, and reserved, though many admitted there was always something off about him, an unspoken discomfort in his presence that no one could quite put their finger on. Yet beneath the surface, the truth about Gregory Shaw was far more unsettling. This identity, this mask, was not a complete rejection of John Kelley's murderous past, but rather a fragile facade designed to protect him while he let his rage simmer in the background. For years the two faces coexisted. During the day, Gregory Shaw remained the mild-mannered suburbanite, but at night, John Kelley prowled the streets under the cover of darkness, feeding his desire to exert power over the world. Signs of the cracks. While Gregory Shaw's life appeared mundane on the surface, there were subtle cracks that hinted at a deeper, darker reality hiding beneath. Susan began to notice small, seemingly trivial behavior that made her uneasy. Gregory was a man of strict control, and if anything disrupted his plans, whether it was a delayed dinner or an unexpected visitor, he would retreat into long bouts of silence. His anger wasn't outright violent but rather cold and unsettling. "What kind of man smashes a plate just because I cooked the wrong meal?" Susan would later recall. Despite her feelings of unease, Susan dismissed them as quirks of a quiet, introverted man. After all, Gregory never raised his voice to her, and he worked tirelessly to provide for their modest life. Still, his mysterious disappearances, sometimes for hours or even days, gnawed at her trust. Neighbors, too, began noticing strange things about Gregory. He wasn't exactly unfriendly, but avoided deep conversations. At community events, others described him as quiet in a way that wasn't reserved, it was distant. One local observed, "He would smile at you, but the smile never reached his eyes, like he was thinking about something else the entire time." Some even mentioned that they occasionally saw Gregory sitting in his truck late at night, parked on isolated back roads, claiming he was clearing his head. His peculiar behaviors were mostly shrugged off. After all, every man had his quirks. No one could have imagined that Gregory Shaw wasn't quirky. He was living a double life as one of the most dangerous killers in the country. The return of John Kelley. While Gregory Shaw lived his carefully constructed suburban life, John Kelley crept back into existence. The predator in him couldn't stay dormant. The lull Kelley experienced during his early years with Susan had not killed his darker instincts, it had merely buried them, temporarily. By late 2003, the signs became unmistakable. The man who once terrorized the Midwest was stirring to life again. John's need for control and violence began re-emerging in small yet troubling ways. In a neighborhood where pets rarely wandered far, several animals began disappearing. While most chalked it up to coyotes, some noticed strange patterns. Dogs and cats left tied up in front yards vanished without a trace, and yet their collars were found days later in trash bins or near the woods. Once a neighbor found Gregory wandering near an empty park at nearly midnight. When questioned, Gregory smiled his usual empty smile and mumbled something about taking a walk to clear his thoughts before simply walking away. Most troubling for Susan was the discovery she made in the attic early in 2004. Hidden among Gregory's belongings was an old leather duffel bag containing duct tape, coiled ropes, a rusted knife, and gloves. Tools that, while seemingly harmless by themselves, carried a sinister undertone when grouped together. When she showed the items to Gregory, he grew defensive, brushing off her concerns with irritation. "They're just tools," he snapped, warning her to stay out of his personal belongings moving forward. The truth, of course, was far more chilling. John Kelley was preparing to kill again. The hidden killings. By 2004, John Kelley had abandoned any attempts to suppress his urges. Though Gregory Shaw still attended cookouts and smiled at his neighbors, John Kelley, the predator, was fully active. During the days when he disappeared from his home, he hunted. He targeted victims with the same precision as before, carefully selecting those who embodied the things he despised: happiness, security, or connection. Unlike his earlier crimes, which often drew media attention due to their brutality, Kelley shifted his methods to avoid any immediate recognition. He ventured farther from his home, preferring to stalk victims along back roads or in isolated rural towns. The murders he committed during this time often bore his signature of unspeakable violence, but his effort to clean the scenes, eliminate evidence, and spread out his crimes meant it took far longer for investigators to connect these killings to him. Kelley had mastered the art of vanishing. He would return home after nights spent further indulging the dark voice inside him, slipping back into the Gregory Shaw mask as easily as a man returning from a business trip. It was this ability to compartmentalize his two lives that made him even more dangerous than before. The duality of evil. The most terrifying aspect of John Kelley's double life was the ease with which he switched between his identities. The neighbors who knew Gregory Shaw couldn't comprehend that the quiet man who helped replace their roof one weekend might be the same person who tortured and killed strangers in another state just days earlier. Susan couldn't reconcile the husband who kissed her goodnight with the man who became cold, distant, and untraceable when his darker impulses took hold. Living like this must have been exhausting, one profiler would later remark. But for Kelley it wasn't a burden, it was just the way he existed. Gregory Shaw was his mask, but John Kelley was his real face. The unraveling. By mid-2004, the mask was slipping. The lull that had allowed Kelley to exist in relative peace was over. The monster inside him was fully awake, and while his attempts to live a dual life had succeeded for years, cracks began forming in his carefully constructed facade. His crimes were escalating again, the killings growing closer together and sloppier as his hunger for chaos overtook his meticulous nature. The inevitable crash between his two lives was approaching fast. Gregory Shaw, the man who fixed fences for his neighbors and helped Susan carry groceries into their quiet suburban home, could no longer keep John Kelley, the killer and animal lurking beneath the surface, at bay. The turning point in the investigation. By 2003, the hunt for John Kelley had stretched across nearly a decade. He had been a ghost, an unstoppable force of violence and mayhem that law enforcement could barely follow, let alone catch. Kelley, now dubbed the Phantom of the Midwest, seemed invincible. His ability to disappear after every attack left investigators frustrated and chasing shadows. For years, he had slipped through the cracks of the justice system, a master of evasion who left communities shattered and terrified. But every criminal leaves behind something, whether they mean to or not. And for Kelley, the moment of reckoning came not with a single dramatic mistake, but with a series of small, seemingly insignificant clues that finally brought the pieces of the puzzle together. The breakthrough began with one of Kelley's rare flaws: overconfidence, the survivor who saw too much. The first major clue in the investigation came from a crime in Ohio in early 2003. A couple had been walking along a dimly lit trail near a public park, a space that had become one of Kelley's preferred hunting grounds. The young couple, both college students, were planning an evening picnic, a simple outing that should have been innocent. But for John Kelley, this was another opportunity to exact violence on those he envied and loathed. People in love, happy, enjoying the life he believed had been stolen from him. Kelley attacked just after sunset, emerging from the shadows armed with his usual tools of terror: a knife, rope, and duct tape. The man was his first target. As was typical of Kelley's modus operandi, he incapacitated him quickly, leaving his female companion screaming in horror as Kelley turned his attention to her. But something was different this time. The young woman, later identified as 22-year-old Emily Hartwell, didn't freeze in fear. Instead, adrenaline and desperation drove her to fight back. She struggled, clawing at Kelley's arms and face while screaming as loudly as she could. Her fight and the echo of her screams startled Kelley, forcing him into a panic and, for one of the first times in his life, retreat. Emily later told investigators that Kelley's eyes during the attack were cold, empty, like he wasn't fully human. Her escape was miraculous, but the encounter left her with deep emotional scars. Though traumatized, she provided something no one else had before: a description of her attacker. Finally, law enforcement had a face to put to the legend. Piecing together a profile. Emily's description of Kelley wasn't precise. He had hidden much of himself in shadows, but it gave investigators their first real clues about the man they were dealing with. She described him as average in height and build, but with a certain roughness to his appearance. Thin, but muscular, with worn hands and a sharp, angular face. The image wasn't enough to plaster across the Midwest as a wanted poster, yet it was a crack in Kelley's carefully crafted anonymity. Detectives began poring over records, matching the description with any known offenders who had slipped through their grasp for similar crimes. This was an exhausting, needle-in-a-haystack endeavor that might have gone nowhere if not for another breakthrough, a small but critical piece of physical evidence left behind during the attack. During the struggle, while Emily clawed at Kelley, she managed to draw blood. Forensic evidence collected from beneath her fingernails revealed a partial DNA profile, a profile that would become the most important lead in the case. Technology closes the gap. While DNA had been a game-changer in criminal investigations for years, the early 2000s marked a new era of advancement in forensic technology. Strides in national databases, specifically the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, allowed law enforcement across the country to compare genetic material against vast libraries of known offenders. When Kelley's partial DNA sample was uploaded into CODIS, it triggered a faint but promising hit. The sample matched DNA evidence recovered from an unsolved homicide in Michigan nearly 7 years earlier, a brutal double murder eerily similar to Kelley's other crimes. This connection didn't uncover Kelley's identity outright, but it confirmed investigators' long-standing belief. The same man was responsible for a string of murders stretching across state lines. For the first time, law enforcement could definitively say they were dealing with a serial killer who had been active for nearly a decade. The case, which had been scattered into disconnected investigations, now became a coordinated effort. The net tightens. Armed with a clearer picture of the phantom they were chasing, task forces from Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Minnesota began collaborating. Evidence from all of Kelley's known and suspected crimes was reevaluated and cross-referenced. Investigators pooled their resources, creating a detailed timeline of his movements based on locations of his attacks, eyewitness testimonies, and any forensic clues he had left behind. Patterns started to emerge, allowing profilers to paint a shocking portrait of the man behind the violence. John Kelley, as the profilers speculated, was not just a killer operating on impulse. He was deliberate, calculating, and incredibly mobile. Unlike many serial killers who operated within localized areas, Kelley used the road as his shield, often traveling hundreds of miles between crimes. His nomadic lifestyle allowed him to blend into anonymity, but it also revealed a flaw, a growing overconfidence that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Breaking the silence. In May 2003, yet another clue surfaced in Illinois, where Kelley had struck years earlier. A man cleaning out an old storage shed near the outskirts of a park discovered something peculiar, a discarded backpack filled with curious items. Inside were tattered gloves, duct tape, and a hunting knife that matched descriptions from the Ohio attack. More importantly, there was a single, torn piece of paper with faint handwriting that included the name of a motel in Minneapolis, along with a date from weeks prior. Though seemingly unrelated at first, investigators saw it as a possible breadcrumb. Kelley, known for roaming, had used cheap motels and campgrounds to evade detection. From this tiny piece of evidence, detectives expanded their search to dozens of motels across the Midwest, following a tedious trail of receipts and guest logs. It was an expensive, time-consuming process, but it yielded progress. Several motels in different states had recorded stays by a man who matched Emily's description of Kelley. Same height, same build, and always paying in cash under no consistent name. Facing the monster. By late 2003, the net began to tighten around Kelley in ways he likely hadn't anticipated. Between Emily's description, forensic evidence, and the connections made through his travel patterns, law enforcement had the faintest edges of an identity. A drifter moving between towns in a weathered sedan, a man who slipped in and out of motels with the precision of a ghost. The case had finally moved past chasing a phantom. They were chasing a man, a living, breathing human being who had left just enough mistakes in his path for investigators to begin closing in. Detectives understood that time was of the essence. Kelley had evaded capture for so long because he was adaptable, unpredictable, and ruthless. If they missed their chance now, he would likely vanish again, or worse, escalate in ways that would bring even more destruction. The pressure was on not just to catch Kelley, but to stop him before he could strike again. The heart-stopping manhunt. As the summer of 2004 crept in, the walls around John Kelley, the Phantom of the Midwest, were closing tighter than ever before. For nearly a decade, he had roamed the Midwest as an enigma, a predator who eluded capture with a cunning that baffled law enforcement and haunted communities. But all predators eventually make mistakes, and Kelley's overconfidence, coupled with years of relentless investigative work, had brought him into sharper focus for law enforcement. What followed was one of the most intense and nerve-wracking manhunts the Midwest had ever seen, an operation that would culminate in a moment of sheer chaos and the long-awaited capture of one of the most wanted men in the country, the final clues. By mid-2004, investigators were no longer chasing shadows. They had traced John Kelley through forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and the meticulous piecing together of his movement patterns. CODIS hits connected him to multiple murders across several states, and motel records gave detectives a partial but useful trail. The net was tightening, and by then, Kelley's name, his true identity, had finally surfaced. He wasn't just a faceless phantom anymore, he was a real, living man. He was John Kelley, a drifter who had managed to live in plain sight under the layered disguise of his suburban alias, Gregory Shaw. The breakthrough came when a Minnesota motel clerk, reviewing police-distributed sketches of Kelley, recognized the man described. She recalled how he paid in cash, kept to himself, and drove a nondescript sedan, the kind of car that disappeared into traffic without a second glance. He'd been staying on and off at a cheap roadside motel just outside Minneapolis for the past few months. When investigators combed through the area, surveillance footage from a convenience store provided confirmation. A man matching Kelley's description had been spotted, looking disheveled, and purchasing supplies with cash. Authorities had a location, coordinating the trap. The discovery set off a chain of events that would merge law enforcement agencies from multiple states. Local police units, FBI task forces, and forensic experts scrambled to coordinate a plan. Kelley was unpredictable and dangerous, a man who thrived on control and chaos. Any approach that tipped him off risked driving him underground again, or worse, provoking another spree of violence. They had one chance to get it right. After confirming Kelley's recent presence at the motel, a series of high-priority meetings and planning sessions followed. Officers were briefed on Kelley's background, his methods, his patterns of movement, and most importantly, his unpredictability and penchant for violence when cornered. "This guy's not going to roll over for us," one FBI agent warned during a planning meeting. "He's a predator in every sense of the word. He's going to fight like one." Surveillance teams began monitoring the motel discreetly, blending into the constant hum of interstate travelers, truck drivers, and late-night transients who frequented the area. Unmarked cars and undercover agents rotated shifts, keeping watch for Kelley's weathered sedan while avoiding any conspicuous movements that might alert him. His room, registered under one of his many false names, was visually confirmed but left untouched. Every precaution was taken to ensure Kelley remained unaware of the net tightening around him. The sudden twist. In the late hours of July 14, 2004, a Minnesota trooper staked out near the motel spotted Kelley's car, a beat-up gray sedan with mismatched hubcaps, pulling into an unlit side lot behind the property. The man who exited matched the description perfectly: thin, angular, with a hunched gait that spoke of years spent lurking in shadows. All at once, the quiet surveillance turned into a flurry of activity. Detectives and agents were alerted and additional units were dispatched to the site. Tension rippled through the task force as they readied for action. Officers on the ground were told to hold position until Kelley could be contained safely. "We can't blow this," came the urgent instruction over the radio. "Contain him, but do not approach until backup is in place." But Kelley, a man who had spent years refining his ability to sense danger, was no fool. Something about the stillness of the night, the slight disturbance in an otherwise undisturbed corner of suburbia, must have set off warning bells. He paused near the back door of the motel, casting quick glances over his shoulder, a predator checking for signs of a trap. Just as officers prepared to engage, Kelley turned abruptly and slipped back into his sedan, the engine roaring to life in the quiet lot. The chase. The moment Kelley's sedan tore out of the parking lot, chaos erupted. Squad cars lit up, headlights blazing, sirens cutting through the still night air as units gave chase. Kelley's reaction was immediate and feral. He swerved onto the interstate at breakneck speed, weaving through sparse late-night traffic with the desperation of a cornered animal. The pursuit stretched across county lines as officers worked to limit civilian risks while keeping close on Kelley's tail. Roadblocks were positioned ahead, and air support was called in to track his movements from above. But Kelley was nothing if not resourceful. When a police cruiser attempted a pit maneuver to force him off the road, he veered suddenly onto a rural exit, barreling down gravel side roads and into the dense Minnesota countryside. The chase became a treacherous game of cat and mouse as officers attempted to navigate poorly lit backroads without losing sight of their target. In one harrowing moment, Kelley cut the headlights on his sedan and disappeared into the dark woods, leaving officers scrambling to re-establish visual contact. Tactical teams were deployed, spreading out into the area with spotlights and search dogs. The woods, heavily overgrown and sprawling for miles, became the stage for what could only be described as a manhunt within the manhunt. The final standoff. It was just before dawn when Kelley's vehicle was located, abandoned deep within the forest. Officers approached cautiously, weapons drawn, and found the car still warm, the driver's side door swinging ajar. Kelley was out there, somewhere in the shadowy expanse of trees. The pursuit turned into a tactical sweep, with agents and officers combing through the area in coordinated teams. Helicopters circled overhead, illuminating the forest floor in eerie bursts of light. Hours passed as tension mounted. Kelley, true to form, stayed silent and invisible, blending into the environment like a predator waiting to pounce. Then, shortly after sunrise, a K-9 unit caught his scent, leading officers to a hidden ravine where Kelley had holed himself up, armed with a hunting knife and crouched like a cornered wolf. What followed was a tense, violent standoff. Kelley refused to surrender, shouting obscenities at officers and daring them to come closer. "You'll have to kill me to take me," he snarled, knife in hand. Tactical negotiators were brought in, but Kelley was beyond reasoning. His years of violence and evasion had culminated in this moment, and he wasn't going down easy. When Kelley lunged at a deputy, the situation escalated. Non-lethal rounds were deployed first, stunning him long enough for officers to close in and subdue him without further harm. By the time the zip ties were fastened around his wrists, bloodied and dirt-streaked, the Phantom of the Midwest was finally contained. The victory and aftermath. When news of Kelley's capture broke, it sent shockwaves across the Midwest. Headlines blared his arrest, and communities that had lived with the terror of his shadow erupted in relief. Families of victims found bittersweet solace in knowing that the man who had destroyed so many lives had been brought to justice. Law enforcement, exhausted but triumphant, viewed Kelley's capture as the end of an era, a reign of terror finally snuffed out. "It was the most difficult case I've ever worked," one investigator reflected, "but in the end, justice caught up with him. That's what matters." Kelley's arrest marked the beginning of a long legal battle, but for many, the knowledge that he was no longer a free man was the closest thing to closure they would ever get. The Phantom of the Midwest had been unmasked, and his bloody legend had come to an end. The shocking confession. After a decade of eluding capture and leaving a bloody trail of devastation across the Midwest, John Kelley, now a man stripped of his layers of false identities and haunting shadows, sat under the glaring fluorescent lights of an interrogation room. He was no longer the Phantom of the Midwest, the faceless, unstoppable predator. He was just John Kelley, a cornered man with nowhere left to hide. His apprehension had sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the public, but no one was prepared for what was to come. When Kelley finally chose to speak, what poured out of his mouth was more than just a confession. It was a window into the fractured psyche of a man whose life had twisted into sheer terror, rage, and chaos. His words painted a picture of despair, resentment, and a hunger for destruction so deep that even the most hardened investigators found themselves shaken. An atmosphere of tension. The confession came after days of tense interrogation. At first, Kelley said nothing. He sat silently in his chair, his sharp, angular features illuminated by the stark light overhead. Detectives described his initial demeanor as unsettling, like a predator silently stalking prey, even while chained to a chair. He barely flinched when investigators played recordings of victim testimonies, presented crime scene photographs, and read accounts of the lives he had ripped apart. Every day, the team wondered whether he'd ever crack. But John Kelley, for all his years navigating a world of lies, control, and deception, seemed in no rush to give them what they wanted. Then, something shifted on the third day. One detective, a longtime profiler, quietly laid a black-and-white photograph of Lily Tanner, the young girl from Chicago whose murder had been dubbed Hell Night, onto the cold steel table. Without a word, Kelley's eyes fixed on the picture. The interview room became deathly quiet. Minutes passed before Kelley's voice broke the silence. "She reminded me of someone," he said flatly, staring through the photograph as though his soul had momentarily left his body. That was all he said before he clammed up again, but it was the first crack the interrogators needed. Over the next 48 hours, Kelley's silence began to shatter, bleeding into one of the most haunting confessions in American criminal history. The confession begins. Kelley's confession began reluctantly, like scratching the surface of a barely healed wound. But once he started, his words flowed with a disturbing clarity that made it impossible to look away. For the first time, he laid bare how he had become the monster who had terrorized the Midwest for years. "I was never going to be anything but this," he stated coldly. "People like me, people born into nothing, don't stand a chance." He spoke disdainfully of his childhood, recalling the poverty, abuse, and neglect that had consumed his early years. According to Kelley, his violence wasn't born overnight, it was cultivated, nurtured by the anger and hatred he felt toward a world he believed had failed him. He described his parents as broken, selfish people, his father a violent drunk, his mother too weak to protect him. His voice, though calm, carried an edge of bitterness. They taught me the same lesson society teaches everyone: the stronger ones survive, the weak get chewed up, spit out, and forgotten. I was never going to be the weak one. A twisted justification for murder. As his confession unraveled, Kelley seemed almost indifferent to the emotional weight of his crimes. He detailed his methods with surgical precision, the way he stalked his victims, how he chose them based on their vulnerability, and the satisfaction he derived not just from the murders, but from possessing total control over their final moments. He admitted to targeting happy couples because, in his mind, they represented everything he had been denied. When I saw them, the way they laughed, the way they touched one another, it was like they didn't know pain existed, like they'd been spared from all the garbage this world throws at you, and that didn't sit right with me. This envy and hatred formed the core of Kelley's twisted motivation. For him, every murder was about power. He wasn't simply taking lives, he was sending a message to the world that had neglected and tormented him. In his warped mindset, each victim was a tally mark against a society he felt had betrayed him. "I didn't do it for money like some criminal," he said at one point. "I didn't do it out of some compulsion I couldn't control. I did it because they were happy, and I wasn't. It's that simple." Chilling specificity. One of the most horrifying aspects of Kelley's confession was his attention to detail. Investigators were struck by how vividly he recalled each crime scene, down to the way the leaves crunched underfoot, the precise sound of his victims crying out in fear, and the overwhelming calm he felt afterward. "I planned everything," he revealed. "When you've been invisible your whole life, you learn to watch, to study people. I knew the timing, the exits, the risks. There was no room for mistakes. Control was everything." He described moments of dark satisfaction, like watching fear grow in his victims' eyes. But what unnerved investigators the most was his admission of post-crime rituals. Kelley lingered at many crime scenes, often rearranging bodies or leaving them in symbolic poses as if to stamp his dominance over them. "I wanted people to see what I'd done and know it wasn't random. They may not have understood the message, but I didn't care. It wasn't for them, it was for me." Years of bottled rage. Perhaps the most revealing part of Kelley's confession was his prolonged commentary on anger and abandonment. For all his calculated violence, the confession revealed an almost childlike sense of betrayal and longing. He blamed the cruelty of his upbringing not just for making him a killer, but for taking any chance at happiness away from him before he was old enough to fight for himself. "They talk about monsters like me as though we were born this way," he spat at one point. "I wasn't born broken. No kid is. But you spend your whole life being ignored, beaten down, laughed at, until you realize there's nothing left in you. That's when the anger takes over." Still, for all his talk of blame and circumstances, detectives noted there was a chilling lack of remorse in his words. Kelley didn't apologize for what he had done, nor did he seem interested in forgiveness. As far as he was concerned, his actions were not just inevitable but justifiable. To him, society was as guilty as he was. "I gave back exactly what I got in life," Kelley said. "Pain for pain." The confession shakes the nation. When news of Kelley's confession broke, the public response was a mix of shock, outrage, and morbid fascination. Media outlets dissected every word, every phrase, every chilling admission. Kelley's story, his hatred, his methods, his apparent lack of remorse, became the subject of countless headlines and nightly news specials. But his words also triggered deeper reflection, forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic neglect, mental health, and the unseen consequences of abuse and trauma. For the families of his victims, however, the confession brought little peace. While it answered questions about how and why their loved ones were taken from them, it underscored the senselessness of the violence. Hearing Kelley justify his actions, blaming his past, blaming society, was like reopening wounds that had yet to heal. "He didn't just take away their lives," said one relative of his victims. "He took away our understanding of the world. How do you explain evil like that? You can't." The legacy of his words. Among investigators, Kelley's confession came to represent something more than just a closing chapter in his case. It became a haunting testimony to the profound darkness a person can harbor. Many described the experience of listening to Kelley as deeply unsettling, not because of his crimes alone, but because of the twisted logic he used to frame them. He talked like he was the victim, one detective later recalled, like the world owed him something, and this carnage, was just his way of collecting. "I've interrogated a lot of killers, but John Kelley, he was something else, something worse. By the time Kelley stopped speaking, the detectives in that room weren't just left with a confession. They were left with a chilling reminder of the depths humanity could sink to when a life was stripped of hope, compassion, and light. The ending and societal lessons. In 2005, John Kelley, the man infamously known as the Phantom of the Midwest, stood before a packed courtroom. Behind the podium of justice, beneath the unforgiving glare of cameras, sat a predator who had eluded capture for nearly a decade. To the families of his victims, he was more than a criminal. He was a symbol of everything wrong with the world, their own personal tragedy made flesh. To society at large, Kelley came to signify something deeper, the repercussions of the cracks in societal care, a monster molded not only by his crimes, but by the neglect and devastation of his formative years. Kelley's trial and later conviction weren't just about securing justice for the 12 lives he had confessed to taking, or the countless others he was suspected of annihilating. It became a reckoning, forcing the country to confront uncomfortable questions about crime, punishment, and the human conditions that create monsters. The courtroom showdown. Kelley's trial was one of the most highly publicized proceedings the Midwest had ever seen. Every day, reporters lined the courthouse steps, hungry for details, while families of victims entered the courtroom carrying both grief and hope, a hope for resolution that had evaded them for many years. The prosecution painted John Kelley as a cold-blooded killer who had stalked and slaughtered his victims with chilling precision. They recounted in horrific detail each of his murders, complete with forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and of course Kelley's own disturbing confession. The defense, in what critics described as a last-ditch effort, tried to steer the narrative towards Kelley's traumatic upbringing. They framed him not as a heartless killer, but as a broken man shaped by poverty, violence, and neglect. His attorneys argued that John Kelley wasn't born evil. He had been forged into it by a society that abandoned him, a child who was never given a chance at redemption. But such arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The raw terror etched into the lives of the victims' families spoke louder than any appeal for sympathy. Witness after witness testified about their loved ones, their hopes, dreams, and futures, all taken in a single horrific moment by a man who felt nothing but hatred for the joy others carried. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before handing down their verdict. Guilty on all charges. The final sentence. On a cold morning in December 2005, Kelley was sentenced to death. The courtroom was so silent that the judge's gavel rang out like thunder. For the families of his victims, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice, in a legal sense, had been served, but it could never bring back those whose lives had been stolen. Kelley himself remained stoic throughout the proceedings. He made no pleas for mercy, no cries of repentance. The man who had once terrorized the Midwest now stood stripped of his power, his mask of invisibility forever shattered. In his final statement, Kelley read from a handwritten letter, his voice flat and emotionless. "I was made to be nothing, and I became nothing," he began. "You all want to paint me as a monster, and that's fine, maybe I am. But I'm just the product of a world that chews people up and spits them out. No one cared about me when I was a child. No one helped me when I was drowning, so why should I have cared for anyone else?" It was not the repentance that many had hoped for. Instead, it was a chilling reminder of the anger, resentment, and hopelessness that had turned John Kelley into the man he became. For some, his words were infuriating, a further attempt to shift blame and avoid responsibility. For others, they were a stark warning of what happens when society overlooks its most vulnerable. The execution. Kelley spent nearly a decade on death row, his time punctuated by more interviews with psychologists and criminologists who were desperate to understand his mind. During these sit-downs, Kelley seemed more reflective but remained devoid of remorse. "I don't regret what I did," he told one interviewer. "It gave me power in a world that never gave me anything." In 2015, 10 long years after his sentence, John Kelley was executed by lethal injection in a maximum security prison in Indiana. His final moments were solemn, devoid of any dramatic apology or outburst. As the drugs coursed through his veins, effectively ending his life, many who had followed his case described it as the closing of one of the darkest chapters in American crime history, a society forced to reflect. Kelley's case left numerous wounds. It wasn't just the lives he took or the families he devastated, it was the larger questions he forced everyone to ask. His story pulled society into an uncomfortable reckoning with the darker truths that shaped his path toward murder. 1. Kelley's childhood was plagued by abuse, poverty, and neglect. His story highlighted how children in broken homes often fall through the cracks of social systems meant to protect them. Report after report emerged following his trial, revealing gaping holes in child welfare programs, overburdened social workers, and school systems ill-equipped to intervene. "We kept asking, how did no one see this coming?" one psychologist later remarked. But when you look back, the signs were all there. He was a ticking time bomb, and everyone just walked by without noticing. 2. Kelley's case reignited discussions about mental health issues in underserved communities. Many wondered if early psychological interventions could have redirected Kelley's path. Would therapy or support have helped? Could intervention programs have reached him before violence became his way of coping? His case became a rallying cry for advocates of mental health reform, with many pushing for wider access to counseling, especially for at-risk youth. 3. Kelley's upbringing in a house ruled by his abusive, alcoholic father sparked dialogues about the generational cycle of violence. Studies already showed how children raised in abusive households are significantly more likely to replicate that behavior or spiral further into destructive paths. In Kelley, society saw the tragic proof of how unchecked trauma could spiral into catastrophe. 4. Kelley's trial and confession dominated headlines, transforming him into a twisted kind of celebrity. Critics argued that such coverage glorified his crimes, turning his name into urban legend and overshadowing the lives of his victims. The media's obsession with the Phantom of the Midwest sparked debates over ethics in crime reporting. How much attention should be given to killers versus honoring the memory of their victims? Lessons for the future. If John Kelley's story was a tragedy, it was one with lessons that society couldn't afford to ignore. Advocacy groups emerged in the wake of his trial, dedicated to reforming policies around child welfare, mental health, and crime prevention. Community programs for at-risk youth saw a surge in funding. Policymakers, shaken by Kelley's chilling testimony and the overwhelming outcry, passed new laws aimed at strengthening social safety nets. Kelley was right about one thing: monsters like him aren't born, they're made, one senator said during a session proposing reforms to state foster care systems. And we have a responsibility to make sure no one else ever has to endure what he did as a child, because when we fail children, we fail all of society. A haunting legacy. For the families of his victims, no reform or societal reckoning could bring back their loved ones. They would forever live with the pain of knowing their joy had been extinguished by someone fueled by hatred and anger. Yet their voices became an integral part of the conversation, reminding people of the human cost of inaction and neglect. Meanwhile, John Kelley remains a cautionary tale. His story is not just of a man turned killer, but of a society that failed to catch him before he fell into darkness. His name, once a phantom whispered in the shadows, now serves as a grim reminder of the consequences of turning a blind eye to suffering. As one of the victim's family members said during his trial, "John Kelley took from us something we'll never get back, but if we learn from this, if we make sure no other child becomes like him, then maybe some good can come from this horror."